Everyone, welcome to today's UNU-INWEH Science Talk. I'm delighted to welcome you. Today's topic is Rethinking Critical Minerals, Political Geology, and the Geopolitics of the Subsurface in Southwest Greenland. My name is Dr. Miriam Axel, and I'm delighted to be your host today. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, it's a pleasure to have you, and we hope you'll come back. We'd like to let you know that the science talks are every week open to the public, and all of our talks are recorded and available on demand, both on our YouTube channel and on our website. You can watch the entire 2024 series as well as the 2025 series on our website at unu.edu/INWEH/science-talks with an S at the end. And today's talk, like all of our others, will be recorded, and this video will be made available shortly after the session. We'll conclude the talk with an interactive Q&A session, so please share your questions in the Q&A box, and I will be sure to read them out to our speaker. You can put questions in at any point. You don't have to wait until the end, and I'll be sure to share them at the end of the talk. And now it is my great pleasure and honor to introduce Thomas Hale. Tom is a political geologist examining how subsurface natural forces shape and challenge geopolitical interests at the surface. And he has a particular focus on Greenland and the broader Arctic. He's a doctoral student fellow on critical minerals supply chains at UNU-INWEH, working on supporting minerals diplomacy to address local and international challenges in extractive negotiations. His professional background includes working for the U.S. Department of State, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, the Mineralogical Society of America, and the Geological Society of America. He's pursuing a PhD in geography and spatial sciences at the University of Delaware. He holds a Master of Arts in Security Policy and Conflict Resolution from George Washington University and a bachelor's degree in political science with a focus on land use planning and mineral resource development. And now, without further ado, it is my great pleasure to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Miriam. I really appreciate it. And thanks, everyone, for joining in for this conversation. I'm really excited to talk to you all today about critical minerals because it's something that I'm very passionate about as a geologist, but over many years it has evolved into very different ways of thinking about the subsurface. And so today, even though we may be familiar with critical minerals, we hear about them in the news with supply chain security and all these other types of geopolitics, I want to focus on some of the most fundamental aspects of extraction and how critical minerals relate to some of the core issues around negotiations and mediations at many of these extractive sites. And so I have two goals today with this presentation. The first is to kind of give you a theoretical overview of what I bring to the table with my research agenda and these concepts of political geology and subsurface geopolitics. So I want to make sure we cover those because they may be relatively new to some of you. And then also, I want to then most importantly apply those concepts to the research that I'm currently doing in Southwest Greenland. As I said, we hear a lot about critical minerals, but today I want us to rethink some of the more fundamental aspects of extraction. So before I jump into my presentation, though, I actually want to give you a little bit of my background. I think that typically when we get into our science, we often just run right into all the research, all the technical information, but I want to give you a little bit of background or the origin story of why I'm doing the research that I'm doing and why I ask the questions that I do, because I think that informs the research that we do, and it helps provide a little bit of contextualization to why I think the way I do about some of these concepts in geology. So as I say here, I had a background in geology. That's kind of where I started off my academic pursuits. I was from a small town, was an EMT and a firefighter, and then realized that I could actually do earth science and study the planet as a career. And I thought that was really incredible. And so just like many young geologists, I got into the field. I wanted to learn about rocks and minerals and things like plate tectonics, the typical things. But then I wanted to ask certain questions. How do we actually apply the research that we do, the geology that we do, to the real world when it comes to things like policy and it comes to negotiations? And so what I ended up finding out, unfortunately, in the case of my early career, was that some of those questions from the departments that I was in were not looked at as the questions that geologists should be asking. You know, most of it was like, we do the research, but as geologists, that doesn't concern us. And of course, for me, I was very much interested about these cross-cutting, intersecting issues. And so I ended up leaving the field of geology, moving over into more international affairs and policy, where I worked on supply chain analysis, security policy, and conflict resolution around mineral deposits. So I've worked on issues with illicit gemstone financing in Afghanistan, and also child labor issues around cobalt and copper in the Congo. And so really a lot of my research came from this idea of what is geology, but what is the relationship to geology with our society? And so that's really why today I'm doing my PhD in geography and spatial sciences, trying to wrap that all together and ask these bigger questions. As you can see here on the right, I wanted to show you where I have been in Greenland. So I've spent 85 days of field work there, and I've spent 20 days in Denmark. This isn't long, but for someone young in their career, just starting off, I've been very fortunate to be able to visit many different settlements across the West Coast, on top of spending a lot of time there. So I'm very lucky to have been able to see very many various communities and talk to them about these important issues. But really, as Miriam said, my fundamental research is really examining the role of the subsurface, geology, we can call those natural forces, in determining, shaping, reframing, or challenging these geopolitical interests at the surface, or what we call social forces. I'm also really deeply involved in mineral education and science communication, because I think it's one thing to do the research that we do, but it's another most really important aspect, which is communicating. So I spend a lot of time meeting with different communities, different age groups, different backgrounds, to really try to highlight this work, because it's really important that we take what we do and we try to communicate that out to the broader public, especially right now in the United States. That's a very important thing to be doing. And so really the question that really starts this presentation comes from Stuart Eldon, who I'll bring back up here in a little bit, which is, how should the geopolitical take account of the geophysical? So again, this interplay and relationship between these two different forces. So let's start off with how we think about critical minerals today. I mean, we hear about them in the news. They're becoming a bigger and bigger issue in our society, even though minerals have always been a part of our society. I've asked this question for many years before it became a kind of a hot topic across the world to talk about critical minerals, which is, why do minerals and materials matter? I think many of us reconcile and recognize the day that if we want to achieve many of our policy initiatives, or we want to find these technologies that are going to combat some of these impacts of climate change, they have a material demand. Most policy solutions do have a material demand. So it becomes extra important when you're trying to solve these large challenges, complex challenges, that you understand where those materials come from, how they get to you, and is it an ethical, environmentally conscious process in order to secure and resource those different materials. But the biggest challenge, I think, and that I find as a geologist, and it's something that I work a lot on when it comes to the mineral education, the communication aspect, is that abstraction is very challenging when it deals with these materials. I mean, it is not like the steam locomotive or past technologies where you could actually visualize some of all the different materials from the periodic table that go into making them. Today, a lot of these materials are very small, they're very tiny, you can't necessarily see, and we don't really, as consumers or voters at the downstream, know exactly what goes into making these products, let alone what they look like at the upstream where they were extracted. And so that becomes a big challenge in today's world. But I think we are increasing our awareness about minerals and how they interface and intersect with all these other fundamental challenges, whether it's water security, human rights, environmental safety. All of these issues somehow intersect with the materiality of our world, partly because our world is a material world. All the different aspects of our society, technological advancements, require those materials. And so, of course, they will interface with other societal challenges. But it's important for us to reconcile that and engage with that realization when we do our geoscience research and talk about critical minerals. I also just want to be upfront and transparent with the fact that I'm a little skeptical when we talk about criticality or strategic or rare, because we got to be very careful. These scientific classifications sometimes shape political and social realities around minerals. They put a lot of urgency, put a lot of time pressures for local communities to have to make decisions. You have all these other fundamental underlying issues going on, but now you have a race to get those minerals. So I think it's important that we recognize that when we talk about critical minerals, that those classifications themselves also shape a lot of the narratives and conversations around the research agenda and what people talk about and engage with in critical minerals. And I argue with my research that the subsurface is an active agent. It is not an inert backdrop. The geology is not this thing that just sits in the back that we interact with, but it is active in organizing state priorities, legal jurisdictions, and the timing and direction of state power. So there is a complete relationship between how we engage with geology, but more importantly, how geology can engage with us. And so, really, it's about integrating social science into geoscience in ways that can help us study and govern these extractive sites. Because we're seeing time and time again that around many extractive sites, which is not new, there's a lot of conflict, there's a lot of mediation that has to take place because the stakeholders have very different perspectives. And I'm trying to find ways to inform that process. So then what is political geology? Well, political geology, it is not just geopolitics or political advocacy in geoscience. At a very basic level, political geology is that the subsurface shapes our politics, and the power of politics reshapes the way we know and the way that we interact with that subsurface. And if that is the case, then that power relationship requires further intellectual engagement. This field is relatively new, around 2016 to 2018, but is theoretically rich in its literature that it contextualizes. But it was a response to the recognition that humans are now viewed as a geologic force by the geoscience community. This idea of the Anthropocene, where we have reshaped fundamentally the surface of this planet to where now geologists have to recognize that we are part of the geologic timetable, even though we have been on this planet for a very small amount of time compared to the geologic story. Why is that important? Well, it was important to social scientists to have to recognize that, wait a minute, we as social scientists, typically concerned with modernity, hundreds to thousands of years, now have to think about geologic timescale. So it was this recognition by social scientists that now they have to think about deep time in their analytical research. So it's this really interesting connection between the two fields. The field also connects critical geopolitics to the field of geosciences. So it doesn't just take for granted these concepts of how we define space, how we understand our relationship to land. These things require further investigation. They require further inquiries from different cultures and different perspectives. And so it allows critical geopolitics to be at the center of geological research, where you just don't assume why and how you know some of these things. You have to go through that process of asking those fundamental questions to make sure that those communities that you're engaged in all agree, or if they don't, we can uncover those differences to help us and improve those negotiations and mediations. And so there are some very important questions that are raised with political geology. The first is how and by whom is geologic knowledge production produced and reinforced. So it tells us to go back and see who was doing these geological assessments. In many cases, it was the state geological surveys. Those surveys may be funded through industrial partnerships. So who is doing that research, who is not doing that research, and who is reinforcing those geologic knowledge production supply chains? It also asks us, how is political power, space, and identity constructed and represented around sites of extraction? It also asks, how do communities that live within extractive landscapes understand, inherit, and reimagine their relationship to geology? Why is that important? Well, it's because we constantly rethink our relationships to land and how we interact with it based off of these subsurface geologies, which is very interesting. And then what forms of knowledge are included or excluded in that research portfolio or the research that is done? And I think that, again, is really important because it just highlights how typically Western geoscience practices have sometimes excluded other cosmologies or practices of engaging with land, and how that plays out is really important around these critical mineral projects of the future. Since we've talked about political geology, let's move over to subsurface politics or subsurface geopolitics. There's three terms that kind of encapsulate this idea, and the first one is subsurface politics. If you are at all interested in what we're talking about today or the aspect of specifically Greenland, I would highly recommend Mark Nuttall, who really brought this to the table. And basically, this argument was how geologic processes, geochemistry, mineral deposits, and the underground infrastructures of our planet structure social, economic, and political life at the surface. Now, that can seem a little abstract at first, but just think about it. The ability for us to engage during COVID-19, the ability for us to have this conversation today comes from the technologies, but those technologies come from those materials. And so, really, what we can do with materials gives us and shapes the world around us, which is a very powerful realization. We go back to Stuart Eldon here, where he talks about vertical geopolitics. So traditionally, in geopolitical analysis, and even today, unfortunately, many states engage with the world in kind of this two-dimensional perspective: maps, boundaries, territories. However, we don't live in a two-dimensional world. We live in a three-dimensional world, which is where volumes, depth, extraction, and subterranean activity all culminate into this broader ecosystem. We have to think about hydrology. We have to think about air. We have to think about all these different issues because they all intersect and are connected to this broader issue within the geopolitical landscape. And then Stewart connects to Ewald Weizmann's argument of volumetric geopolitics, which is just an extension, but it investigates how power operates across those vertical planes, and that reveals layered spaces of contestation and political strategy. What does that mean? Well, it means that the way that the state and the governments interact within air, within water, underneath the ground, on land, all changes. It's that the realization that the geological surface, these landforms, these obstacles, natural obstacles or natural barriers, create differences in political strategy. And so it is worth investigating how the subsurface itself creates a different political strategy based off of its properties. So then why do I bring all these concepts together? And why do I try to resonate these with the field of geology and critical raw material studies? Well, the first is that geologists are already trained to think three-dimensionally. I mean, and we go out in the field and we look at these rocks, we have to piece that story back together. We're constantly thinking about deep time calculations. So this volumetric approach, this mindset, is already built and established into the geoscience framework, which I think is really important, that we're not reinventing the wheel here. We are just reframing and rethinking the way we talk about the subsurface. As geologists, we are also actively engaged in building narratives. What do I mean by this? Well, it is essential when we uncover and describe our planet's history that we tell these stories. Therefore, it becomes increasingly important in today's world to understand who is telling those stories, who has not been telling those stories, and how those narratives have been shaped and reinforced over time, and how those can potentially come out in conflict on some of these extractive sites. And then, of course, many of today's world's problems have very power-centered issues around them. So there's a lot of power dynamics that warrant further investigation. So, of course, in geosciences, we have to reflect on those issues, which I think is really important, and this field tries to push forward. And then it's really just the recognition that our planet is active. It isn't this inert backdrop. We're only here for a short amount of time, 80 to 100 years, if that. And our lifestyles and our ability to comprehend this deep geologic time can be very difficult. But our planet is constantly active, is constantly changing, and our relationship to that planet is constantly changing. And what that means is that if we are going to solve these complex challenges across the volume, then we need to think across the volume, and we need to think through time. And so these different perspectives and these coalitions across these perspectives become very important to reconcile and engage with when you're doing these mining negotiations. But I will admit, that there are some gaps and there's some critiques. So there are some missing puzzle pieces to this theory before we move over to the Greenland aspects. And I think this is where my research, and also I think future research, and I encourage people to work with me on these issues in your own work, where I think we need to move forward. And the first one is, what are the practical applications of this theory? There's a lot of wonderful research, a lot of great work being done, but a lot of it still sits in the realm of theory, where I think we can do a better job in the literature of actually trying to connect it to concepts of social license, free, prior, and informed consent, environmental and social impact assessments, to where how can these frameworks inform and help uncovering some of those conflicts in these assessments. And I think that's where I want to see the field move and some of the practicalities. I also asked the question, where are the geologists in political geology? Believe it or not, there are very few geologists that are engaged in this conversation right now. The UK is kind of where this has grown out and is developed through Adam Babbitt. But really, right now, I don't see much engagement in the literature between geologists employing these methods that many of the social scientists have, created to respond to these geologic realities. And so I think I want to see more engagement between the geologist and the political geologist, which sounds silly to say out loud, but basically it is the fact that there is a siloing effect, which we see a lot in the field, that needs to be resolved if we're going to truly address some of these critical mineral issues. I also see there's a lumping together in some of these articles and research when it comes to saying that all of these are geologic actors or all mining company actors or they're all geologists. There's so many different people involved in these supply chains and these critical raw materials that it warrants further investigation into the different components of different actors. And so we need to recognize, and I think part of this is because the field and people who currently write in it were not geologists. But there's a difference between a mining engineer, a mining exploration geologist, a consulting geologist coming in, doing the geochemistry of the deposit. These are all differences that need to be understood and aware in the policy making process. And then space is well covered here. Again, we talk about volume and verticality, but what about time? We know that people interact with land differently, but they interact with land differently across time. A mining company will not be there potentially in 100 years, but that community will be. So chronopolitics, or the politics of time, I include into a lot of my theory. We won't talk about it today, but I wanted to just include that time is also very important in these debates. And then how do we take these policies and these ideas and these methods and bring it into the classroom? And it's so important for me to try to take these concepts and say, how can we help train geologists, future policymakers, to really think deeply about these critical mineral issues and move past just the economics, the supply chain security rhetoric, and really try to fundamentally understand some of the challenges that have been and continue to be around extraction. And I think this is what the field really does. So, with that said, I want to move over to Greenland's role in this conversation. But what I want to highlight first is something really important, and that is that I am an outsider. I'm a foreign researcher that is doing work in Greenland. I am trying to build trust within these communities. But even though I am talking about Greenland's position today in these critical mineral issues, I do not make any authoritative claims about what Greenlanders should and should not do. They have a very vibrant culture with a lot of different political realities and futures. So it is fully up to the Greenlanders to determine their future and where they want to go in that future. And there's a lot of different pathways. And so today I'm just looking through the work that I've done and trying to understand this relationship. But I always want to reiterate that it is truly up to the Greenlanders to make the decisions for themselves. No other nation, no other actor should try to move or sway that conversation in any other way. But I think we have all recognized this year that Greenland has become a very important conversation in the Arctic, especially with their position in the Arctic Council. But it is this emerging role in the Arctic, which I think has been important for a very long time, but is now getting a lot of international recognition. That all these things become very complicated when you also look at these movements towards economic and national independence from Denmark. And I say this because a lot of that comes back to how do you finance that independence? And a lot of people have suggested that the mining sector will be a source of that financing. I think folks that maybe work in other parts of the world can see how that can be problematic if you depend upon your independence with critical minerals or mineral supply chains. But that is where the conversation sits today. And so it makes it more important that we have these fundamental conversations about extraction before Greenland moves into those important decisions. And then one thing that I, really think a lot about is how are these deals or these mineral deals going to be negotiated? When we look out the world today, we see a lot of agreements between the United States talking to Ukraine or talking to the Congo, and there is this military defense strategic aspect to the mineral deals. And one of the challenges is even though Greenland isn't independent and has self-rule, its foreign affairs are typically still the responsibility of Denmark. And so I'm always concerned about what power may they give up or have to give up in order to make these other mineral deals to gain independence if the financing is going to come from mining. I don't think it should solely come from that, of course, but if that is the decision, I am concerned about how these broader deals that we see in the world, for some reason, have a military defense component, because that is something that the Greenlanders currently can't negotiate with equally as the Danes could. And so I don't want to see that power dynamic play out in any sort of negative way. And then there's also this, recent elections happened this year. There was a lot of politicization of the subsurface, a lot of concerns about just mining investment in general, but also foreign influences. There's been covert and overt operations in Greenland to try to sway the elections, or also try to sway the population in certain directives and ways to actually be more pro for these critical mineral projects. And that makes it even more challenging when you have a very small population, you have a very important issue and a very important future to decide. But then you have these politics that underlie critical minerals, but all you hear about in the news is we need them, we need to secure them, it's for the better for the world, but really these are really important questions to ask. And so in this case, the narratives of the subsurface continue to permeate commentary. You continue to hear that Greenland is empty, or there's not much use space, but really Greenland is fully lived in. And there are so much engagements with the land here that I think we have to consider all these other stakeholders when we think about mining in the country. And so really the thing is, what does extraction mean for Greenland? For whom and by what terms does that extraction happen? I think these are really the fundamental questions as we go forward. So my research area specifically in Greenland is not typical of a social science project where I pick a territorial map and say this is the town or this is the region. I am doing my research based off the subsurface geology. So I am looking specifically at the Godar Igneous province in southwest Greenland, using that geology to kind of give and tell me where that case study area is going to be, which you see a lot in geoscience research. I have three primary case studies for my work that I do in Greenland, which is the Iviktut cryolite mine, the Granadel-Ika carbonatite, and the Illimosuk intrusive complex. And that's split into two different sites, which is the Kjavenfjeld and the Kringlerne deposit, the upper and the lower, which have their own different political issues. Today, we're just going to talk about Iviktut and the Illimosuk, and you probably may not heard of the second one, but you will once you recognize that it is the one that we hear about in the news so much. And for me, the most fascinating point here is that despite their formation over 1 billion years ago, their geochemistry, their exploration histories shape the geopolitical narratives and foreign engagements today. As a geologist, it's quite jarring to go back over 1 billion years and then to be thrusted right back into, just within the last 20 years, this geopolitical rivalry and this issue around some of these materials, especially in the context of Greenland, when it's like very different timescales that we're talking about here. So then let's apply those approaches that we talked about to the two case studies, and then we'll open it up for questions. But what I want to do here is I'm not going to go through the history of many of these case studies, but I'm just going to give you the findings by using the approaches of thinking about the subsurface and the relationships and what that tells us about these two different case study sites. So the first one is the Iviktut cryolite mine. This is a famous mine site. It was one of the Greenland's most prolific mines in the country's history. It's a former mining conclave. It operated, you can go back the earliest to 1854 to 1987, and it is located in the southwest in the Arsuk Fjord. The community that lives nearby, of course, was much larger during the mining operation, but there are about 75 people there in the summer. So a very small community that live near this site. But what became really interesting when I started doing my research at Iviktut was the realization that most of the research here in Iviktut is just focused on the geoscience. And pretty much none of the geoscience actually engages with any of the other social or political dynamics of the mine's legacy, let alone what was going at the time of extraction. So there's a disconnect between the geoscience research and what was going on in the world at that time. Or more importantly, how, when we look back at the mine site, how those political social realities changed Greenland politics and the local community's futures for a very, very long time. So it was just interesting to see this, and it's not uncommon when you go to these frontier zones, and I hate using that word, but these places where a lot of geologic studies are done, but none of those geologic studies really connect to the broader applications around the dynamics of why they're mining it in the first place, which I think is a huge gap in the geological research knowledge production. It also showcases to us the importance of geochemistry to our society. Cryolite was used as a solvent. It basically reduced the energy consumption and the melting temperature to produce alumina from bauxite ore in the Hall process. And if it wasn't for cryolite, we would not, as a society, have aluminum being as ubiquitous as it is today. And so for this one material that was only mined in Greenland, this was the only mine of cryolite in the entire world, this material changed the way that we interact with our world today. It changed the way that we interact with society today, with the ability of aluminum or aluminium to be so ubiquitous. And so it's important to note how we, let alone maybe don't know about Iviktut, but very few of us know about cryolite and its importance to our everyday life, which is that disconnect that we're identifying here. And then much of the earliest geological studies in Greenland. So we talk about how is knowledge produced, who is it produced by, and what is the money and the funding of it. Many of these earliest documents around the geophysical, geochemical assessments in Greenland came from the financing of Iviktut. So this colonial mining operation, this mining project, then created more knowledge about the geology in Southwest Greenland, which today, those reports, of course, geologists build onto those early reports, have provided many of these economic cases for mining in Southwest Greenland. So many of these older mine sites that you hear about in the news are directly coming from early expedition work and research work from the proceeds of the Iviktut site, which means that if you have issues with that past, then you also have to recognize that that money was also used to further determine the subsurface resource potential of the country. And so I just also wrote a paper here on mineral diplomacy, which is more of an extension of state interest. Unfortunately, we see this time and time again where mineral diplomacy is often defined as these engagements between states with very little consideration of what goes on at the local level or that local community impact. Because when you hear about critical mineral projects or these big giant initiatives, very little do you hear about the actual people and their realities around those sites. And so it becomes a big challenge when diplomacy is really not towards the people. Diplomacy is between corporations and states. It really makes it difficult in this mediation of these mine sites. And then Iviktut, despite being abandoned, I put that in quotes because it really isn't abandoned, but despite being closed down since 1987, it continues today to define Danish and Greenlandic culture. Why? Recently this year, a documentary came out called Greenland's White Gold. You can see the play on words there, calling it white gold, even though it has no relationship to gold. It's just trying to elicit these ideas of what gold has meant to many communities across the world in a negative connotation. But that documentary came out. There's a lot of criticism about its economic calculations. It ended up being taken off the air, even though it was shown at other Indigenous film festivals and is getting an award in Greenland. But it highlighted this idea of colonial extraction and the unforeseen cost to many communities' futures in Greenland. And so that has really framed a lot of these political debates during the election this year from a place that has been shut down for a very long time. So it just shows us how important geology remains to be and continues to be, and how it shapes our political and social lives today. And then now we'll end on the Illiamsuk intrusive complex. This is the one that you will probably hear about a lot in the news, but you won't hear it referred to the specific names in Greenland. So this is, first off, what's interesting about this site is that it is split into two different sections. We can look at the geology map here on the right, and we can tell just through the visualizations that the geology looks completely different from the upper part and the lower part. Still, both of them are interested in rare earth mining, but the geology changes. Now that geology, even though formed in one igneous intrusion, was actually cut in half by other glacial geologic forces that cut it in half, divided these two different deposits into completely different geopolitical stages. And that, I think, is really fascinating to think about. The first is the Kjanfjeld, which is the upper part of the deposit. And this has been the one that you've heard a lot about when it came to Greenland's uranium ban. So when they banned the uranium over 100 parts per million, this company had already been doing exploration work here at the site, which meant that prevented them from doing further work. So they have now sued the government of Greenland for over $11 billion USD, which is about 3 to 4 times the GDP of the country. That's significant because basically what this deposit is doing is it is saying the mining companies that you either need to make sure your mining policy doesn't change or no one will want to invest in your country. So this has put the mining question into a very high stakes position that Greenland has to determine things and they can't go back, they can't change, which is all why it is more important that we think about these issues so that we don't just keep changing because then all these lawsuits will come out. And Greenland cannot afford an $11 billion lawsuit. This is also an area in the company at this site that historically it has some sort of Chinese investment. So if you heard about Chinese interest in rare earths, is because there was some Chinese ownership in the mining company. That has since went away, but it is not unusual, especially with rare earths, to have some sort of Chinese engagement there. But also from an Australian company, it wasn't unusual. But for political reasons, it got a lot of news. And then the lower deposit is the Kringlerne, and this centers the deposit around U.S. intervention in Greenland and foreign investments. And why do I say this? Because this is the deposit that you hear a lot about with the U.S. interest in Greenland. This is when they say we want rare earths in Greenland. This is the lower deposit, is the one that is getting closer to the potential of extraction. And this is where the U.S. is wanting to put in over $140 million from the U.S. Export-Import Bank to finance it. So it's a very interesting site. But also this site also highlights some of the challenges around exploration companies and how they create these narratives, because the mineral that contains the rare earths here, again, this is why geochemistry matters, is called eudialyte. It's a very complex mineral, but there's actually no proven economic process at a large scale. The pilot scales show a lot to actually extract the rare earths at a certain percentage that they say they can do. So you need to scale these things up, and really we don't have that proven right now. So I think that there's going to be a lot of challenges ahead, despite the narrative being that there will be no challenges. We just need to get all the folks together in the supply chain. But time and time again, we see that the geochemical realities, the metallurgical realities, don't make it into the news or don't make it into political analysis. And that is why it's so important that we understand the geology of what we're talking about. And so at this deposit, what has happened here is that the geologic forces have set the stage, and that these external markets continue to reshape and redefine the subsurface, despite local communities being in limbo for many, many years. I will never forget someone in Nosak telling me that, the ice and the minerals continue to be the main actor in their own story, and that they've always wanted to focus on the community's interests. But I think that if you are constantly potentially going through, this mine is going to open up in 5 years and it doesn't open up in 5 years and we do another 5 years, that the question really becomes, can we build a future if we don't know what the future is going to be? So I think this is why it's so important that we understand these concepts and reconcile them early on through that geologic research. And so really what Brunn, who studied this deposit too, has said that the geologic knowledge produced in the Illimosik did not isolate fragments of pre-existing realities. It transformed the Illimosik deposit into a complex, governed entity. And so in order to make something governable, you have to make it knowable. And in order to make it knowable, you have to go through and do this research, which is, again, why it becomes really important for geologists to know how their research is applied and used outside of the work that they do. And so to end on this, I just have a few key takeaways. So if anything, this is the main points I want us to talk about and to think about. The first one is that there is a clear disconnect right now in critical raw material discussions between those who need or want the materials and those living around the extractive zones. This disparity in power dynamic is quite clear in many of these sites, and it is something that needs further investigation, because I think we do not spend enough time, especially in the geological work, engaged with those communities that are going to be living around these sites of extraction, especially when we look out into the future and see how many indigenous communities and countries are going to have to face many of these critical mineral challenges, which could help the world, but could also create other political issues at home. There is also an urgent need, I think, to address these cultural understandings of land, of resources, of the relationship between our humanity and the subsurface in environmental and social impact assessments. Do these assessments currently, in the case of Greenland, I don't think they do, properly reflect and elevate indigenous perspectives, not about how science is done, but how land is viewed and understood? I think that's really important. And then, of course, stakeholders here, they share a similar space and time. They're engaged in these mine sites, yet their perspectives around time and their relationships are completely mismatched and typically unaccounted for in these negotiations. So, how do we put these kind of time perspectives into these impact assessments so that we can actually see what is the difference in engagement across time with these different stakeholder groups at an extractive site? And how does that matter? And how should that be accounted for in the economics and the political negotiations? And then I think for Greenland, there's this blurring of independence financing and mining economies and all these different things, which create concerns for long term management and political pressures, which can move folks in a certain direction. So I think that is really important that we understand some of the fundamentals here because it can push and have a lot of pressures from the outside external world when it comes to extracting minerals. And so, really, the main takeaway is that the subsurface shapes our politics, and the power of politics reshapes the way that we imagine, understand, and interact with the subsurface. And with that, I'm more than happy to take any questions that you have and look forward to engaging with you further.
Felix, thank you so much. That was really interesting and quite different from a lot of our other research and presentations. So really enjoyed that. I'm also very glad that you started out with your own motivations and background. And, as somebody who's also sort of bitten the geology bug, first time going out into the field and really geeking out, I'm really glad that you brought in that perspective. Um, I want to talk a little bit more about um, your field work, and I guess I mean, you're saying that political geology is beyond geopolitics applied to minerals, and I'm wondering how you think this perspective changes the way we think about critical raw minerals and environmental issues generally. What are some of the broader lessons that we can take from this?
Sure. I think, I'm very fortunate, and I think it's really important for me to go out to a lot of conferences and speak with a lot of people. We put up a lot of exhibits around critical minerals to talk about these issues. And I will never forget meeting a young researcher from one of the key mining schools in the US who was doing their research and traveling to Alaska. And I said, well, have you worked with the local Indigenous council or communities there? Have you, who maybe own that, who have the resources and stuff? And they said, well, they don't own the land. That's not their land. These are just the rocks. I can go take the rocks, whatever I want to do. And I think that we have to have these very important conversations with geologists about these issues because I think it comes up time and time again where there is this assumption that we're out there doing geological research, we're just looking at rocks, and there's no high stakes for us. But there are high stakes for the communities that live around those mine sites. So I think that just bringing some of these concepts into the field of geoscience, the way that we approach pedagogy when we're talking about this could be very, very useful. I think the Colorado School of Mines has something called humanitarian engineering, which is kind of an approach to looking at engineering from a very different perspective. And I think that this is a way that we can approach geological field research from a very different perspective so that before you go into the field, before you start collecting samples, that you have an understanding and a knowledge of the political boundaries and conditions that shape the lives of many of these communities in which you operate and work in. And I think many geologists come to me saying that we were out here looking at rocks and all of a sudden the local came up and got really angry at us and we didn't know what to do because we weren't trained on how to handle those situations. And I think that's something that I want to see more of is more training around some of these kind of considerations and questions that need to be asked from political geology. I think geologists, again, the mindset's there already. We're thinking on the same terms. We just need to ask the right questions to make sure we are doing things ethically and doing it without impacting communities maybe negatively.
Really appreciate the way you've presented this very different framing and driven it home with the case studies. I'm also wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the community perspectives and from your experience there, if there were.
Oop, you lost me on the last end there. I lost your last bit. You said
Oh,
community. No, you're fine.
okay. Yeah, I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about some of the specific community perspectives and any of them that might have, disrupted or complicated the official narratives about mines, and maybe what the experience of Greenland can help us avoid,
Yeah.
repeating colonial legacies.
Yeah. So I think, one of the, again, something that leaves me and is stuck with me for a very long time is just that that word bit about, the main characters of Greenland continue to be the ice and the minerals. And I think that's kind of counter, it seems a little confusing because, of course, we're thinking about Greenland in terms of climate change, but it is very interesting to hear from locals that they do feel that many times those are bigger than their own lives. I think in the case of Greenland, one of the challenges is that for many of the geologists that are coming in and doing the research, or for these mining companies that are doing these consultations in Greenland, it is assumed that we were all on the same exact page of what these materials mean to us, what the materials will mean for us later down the line, and our relationship to that land and that geology. That is not the case in many instances. And I have found that working with Greenland, the culture has a very different perspective. And that's all places around the world of how they relate to land and how they engage with the subsurface and what that means to them and how it shapes their, realities. And so for me in Greenland, it was this recognition that, wait a minute, if I just go in and start talking about rocks and minerals and we need this for the, the energy transition, I'm already starting at a complete mismatch of common understanding and communication. And so that's why I think as a geologist, you need to go in and ask these very important questions. What does this mean to you? How does the subsurface geology shape your life? How does it shape your reality, your everyday living? And why is that important? Because it then informs my research on why when I'm out there studying, I can make sure I'm doing things that match the realities at the local level, not just talking about rocks and assuming that everybody agrees with me on why we need them, why they're important, and what it means to that community. Because I don't think we've done a good job at making that very clear. Maybe why we need them now, we've done a good job. But I think locally, there's a huge disconnect between indigenous value systems and these kind of extractive narratives in Western science that we continue to see time and time again.
We have an audience question from Dr. Reem Abushamar. She says, in light of colonial-dominated political structures and the current global competition over critical resources, what frameworks or examples have you found in meaningfully integrating Indigenous sovereignty, especially in ways that redistribute decision-making power and challenge extractive governance models?
Well, I think there are models in Canada and other places where you have seen attempts. Again, like we have so many positive things. Like I always tell geologists, I'm not here to say stop geology research and geology is just awful. I think there's been a lot of great things with free, prior, and informed consent, social alliance, social license to operate, concepts that are really fundamental. But we got to recognize that many of those concepts came through discussions and dialogues with social scientists to bring those into these, important spaces. I think that there are great platforms, again, these kind of different mechanisms that we use. However, I think that the fundamental issue is that we don't agree on what the materials are and what they mean to us. I think we just assume that. So even though these models exist, which are giving indigenous communities more sovereignty to make decisions and more benefits from the mine sites, I think it still overlooks those value systems and those perspectives of what geology truly means and how it means to actually interact with land differently. Because when I see an indigenous community in Greenland, yeah, maybe they have more of a say. Their government is indigenous, which is unique in the Arctic for many Arctic indigenous communities. They may have a decision, but still they're using the same underlying frameworks that are colonial frameworks. The geology still is very dependent upon colonial frameworks. So how can you truly give all that over an agency if the fundamental frameworks that you use to understand the subsurface and understand the world is still based upon those colonial frameworks? You can give all of those, basically treats and things to people to really get more buy-in, but that is not fundamentally changing that aspect of colonial history in those extractive sites. You're just giving them more, but you're not actually solving that problem.
I really like that that quote that you had about the ice and the minerals continuing to be the main actor in the story, and the questions about uncertainty around the future. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how would policymakers handle, fair mineral futures if the future itself is so geologically uncertain? And can we build fair futures if there's so much uncertainty?
That's a big question. um, I think that for me, where I'm at personally as a researcher and as someone who, again, started off as a geologist, has had this kind of reflective realization of how geologic knowledge has been used and many times by states against maybe the best interest of local communities. I I I think all I can do is try to get a better understanding of what it means to exist and respect and live within our planet and the land that we engage with. And when we talk about extraction, extraction is literally, it is fundamental to human nature. I mean, from the first stone tools to the Bronze Age to the Iron Age, we have always utilized resources. That's part of who we are as a species. However, I think that the relationship that we have between us and our planet and how we use and extract those resources is the most important question. So for me, I am really at my point just trying to get more people to question and think about what are we actually doing when we're going out and extracting these resources? How are we engaging with the planet? How are we framing it? And in the case of many places like Greenland or other places in the Arctic, are these systems of science that we do part of those indigenous communities and indigenous values? Are they still part of our Western practices and maybe, kind of accentuating these colonial tropes that are very different ways of engaging with land? So for me, it's a lot about how do I reframe and think as a geologist, how I collect, how I go out and do field research. Um, is it the same or is it different than how other communities, indigenous groups would do it? And what values and what lessons can I learn from working with them on how I can better be better at relating and engaging with my planet? Because I think that right now we don't do a good job at engaging and living with our planet. I think in many cases we don't listen enough to our planet and to the communities that often do listen to the planet. As big as climate change can be, again, local action is also very important.
I couldn't agree more that I think we're not doing enough, we're not listening enough. And on that note, you have a question from my team who says, "Nice presentation. What lessons from the Inuvialuit cryolite mine's legacy should inform future extractive negotiations and policy decisions in Greenland?" And it's also asking if you can share examples from your fieldwork where Indigenous perspectives have influenced or challenged these kinds of negotiations in Greenland.
Yeah. Okay. So for Inuvialuit specifically, um, one, there was really no environmental management at Inuvialuit. There's a huge environmental legacy there. And at another mine site in Greenland, which is the Black Angel mine, which was a lead, zinc, typical sulfide minerals that we're always concerned about in the world. Um, and really, there was no environmental legacy. Also, for the earliest parts of the mine's history, the Greenlanders were excluded from a lot of the work in the mine because they were not seen as capable of working in the mine. So there was this race kind of discriminatory nature and racist nature against the Greenlanders who cannot be engaged in that mining process. So for a very long time, they were completely excluded. And for today's lessons, you would say, okay, well, we need to have more Greenlanders involved in their own geologic knowledge production and their mining space and getting that involved. That's kind of a recommendation that I have. The challenge is that are you going to go train Greenlanders in the practices of geology as it has been done in Western science, or do you need to find new innovative approaches of how geology can be taught in Greenland? So for me, I think Inuvialuit is a great example of what has been done that should not be done, and that for the Greenlanders, they should encourage students to study that and engage in that to figure out how can they create their own kind of geologic knowledge production systems that do not follow down the same extractive tropes that we see, unfortunately, in Western sciences. So I think that, unfortunately, though, we don't see much engagement in the geosciences when it comes to in training people in Greenland. I think that that's something that needs to be a conversation. I've talked to the university. I would love to see more conversations and engage, like how can we get the Greenlanders create their own earth science curriculum that reflects their own values. I think that would be so super powerful, using Inuvialuit as a really good case study because it highlights the colonial history, it highlights the environmental issues, and it highlights how Greenlanders were excluded from that process in most every step of the way. Of course, that changed over the life cycle of the mine, but that was the case. And then the second, can you remind me of the second part again? Sorry.
The second part is, can you share examples from your fieldwork where Indigenous
Yes.
perspectives that have influenced or challenged negotiations?
Yeah, so I think, in negotiations or in this kind of concept of just critical minerals in general, I mean, the word critical, again, it kind of bugs me. It puts that urgency on the table. Like, it has to be done. It is so important. It needs it. And then maybe it is important, right? But that doesn't mean that you kind of trampede over all these other issues just because something is important. And so for me, what has been most insightful as a geologist, and that is why I've included time. So a lot of my dissertation research, I didn't talk about it today, includes time into spatial geopolitics, which the volumetric and vertical geopolitics. So I actually include time. Why? Because as a geologist, I have to think about deep time. As a policymaker, you think about future time. And for many indigenous communities, they have very deep time perspectives and relationships to land. I think it's really incredible when I go out and travel with some folks in these fjords and hear about all the histories and the stories of land and how they tell their stories through the landscapes, and how unfortunately that way of thinking about land and that deep history with land unfortunately doesn't get resolved and reflected in a mining negotiation process, because it's like, we need to mine it, we're going to be here for 50 years, 100 years, then there's going to be a reclamation or remediation phase, and then we're out and we're done. But to that community, they've given up a lot for those 50 years, those 100 years. And so that time perspective is so deep for many local communities in Greenland, but it's just not elevated at all in a mining process. I mean, if you're going to discount or you're going to try to understand how and what the real impacts are of these mining projects, it's not just the environmental social impact today, it is the impact across time. Because if the Greenlanders are going to, let's say, open up a mine site in the south, and then they also want to have their local labor do it, right? They want to have the best, local labor to do that. Then that means that they're going to be working on that mine, but when it closes down, now they have to go find another economy. And I come from a coal mining town in Appalachia where I have to go leave my family, leave where I come from to find a good job. And I don't want to do that. I am connected to my Appalachian Mountains. I love my mountains. I don't want to leave that. So I think that we have to be aware that um, in many cases, the Greenlanders are in a very tough position. But their perspectives about land could be very insightful in these negotiation processes. Because right now, I don't think any of these policy negotiations, mediation plans, impact assessments properly account for how we perceive space differently through time. We just see it as space and time as we are engaged with it, and these time scales that we put. But as a geologist, I can almost resonate with those indigenous perspectives more because I'm already attuned to thinking about deep geologic time already. So I think that's why there's a lot of good opportunities for coalition building by bringing in those time perspectives, because we're all thinking about time differently. But I think the geologists and indigenous communities are actually on the same page a lot when they have to think about deep time relationships to land. And I think that's very interesting.
You bring up a lot of the sort of mismatches in perspectives and the challenges with all these really complex issues. And I'm also thinking about, a little bit the elephant in the room that Greenland's long been viewed as so strategically important in the U.S. And I guess I'm wondering if you think first how, from your perspective, we should think about the U.S. and other major powers' role in Greenland's mineral future. And if you think that this can create opportunities for more cooperative forms of mineral diplomacy rather than just continuing to repeat patterns of resource dependency.
Good question. Personally, I think, and I write this in the recent paper that I did, that mineral diplomacy, as it has been done and as it is being done today, is not to the benefit of the people that live around the sites and the people that will be most impacted. I think right now, diplomacy and discussions around critical minerals benefit those in power, benefit the companies that have interest in investing in it, and benefit the states themselves for their own political and economic reasons. Um, I I personally, think that as far as the U.S. goes, it gets very difficult as a researcher to constantly have a legitimate position working in Greenland when my country every day says we're going to take over Greenland or we're going to do these different things and stuff like that. I think that there's a lot of opportunity for mineral diplomacy when it comes to engaging with supporting education, supporting infrastructure development, supporting all sorts of things that would be very useful and very helpful. But we're not doing that right now. We're just talking about owning the resources rather than it is building the infrastructure and building up communities to help them take advantage of those resources if that's what they want to do, right? Only if that's what they want to do. So I think that the full fundamental aspect of mineral diplomacy and the way that we do critical minerals, I'm very critical of that. And I make that very clear that I'm critical of the status quo of how we talk about minerals and how we engage with communities around extracting them. I think that really the only future in mineral diplomacy and in sincere engagements is that instead of it being this state to state, it has to be people to people. It has to be people who say, we want these minerals for this, and we're asking you, can we open up this mine site? Instead, it's this government. And I've seen this play out in Finland, where I have went to Finland. I've heard about this mineral security partnership that the United States had under the Biden administration. And I go to the community and I meet with the local administrators, and they say, we haven't heard anything about this mineral security partnership. Well, how is that the case that at the large diplomatic state to state on the TV level, we're talking about critical mineral alliances, but then when you actually get to the people, they have no knowledge of that. They have no idea what's being planned. They have no idea of the economic stakes at hand. And then by the time it gets to them, there's so much pressure locally, politically, and economically on that community to say yes at that point because it's already been determined by the state that we're going to do it. So even in the case of Greenland, I think there's an important distinction to be made between power centers and nuke and the communities and people that live outside of nuke. And I think you'll see that dynamic play out as you do anywhere between capital cities and the people that live outside of the capital, which is what, of course, Mark Nuttall talks about. The center of abstraction for geoscience typically happens in the capital. And then as you get further away from the capital, you get a very different approach to how resources should be dealt with because they get closer and closer to the people that actually live there at the site. So I think the way that we do extraction and mineral and all this stuff, even though it's fundamental to our human nature, is fundamentally backwards and not correct because we have to work with the communities first, not the state interest or corporate interest. It has to be what the communities want. And I don't think we do enough at engaging with them on that issue. It's so powerful and hard to move against that power by the time it gets to their doorstep.
I think unfortunately we're out of time. There's one final question that just came in from my team, and I think you sort of touched on it, but maybe we'll close on this one. Is how can the frameworks of political geology and subsurface geopolitics be adapted to other regions with significant mineral resources, such as the Congo, Latin American lithium triangle?
Yeah. Well, I think that's the beauty of political geology is that it is a framing, it is a way of asking questions to better understand the relationship of the subsurface and the politics that take place on the surface. So you can apply these questions, you can apply this realization to any place in the world. Now, of course, those cultural differences are going to be there, the political differences, the economic situations are all going to vary. But the subsurface is going to be what you're going to ask those questions about. And then you're going to try to go from there and begin to pull in these other historical, political issues. I mean, literally, all that I do is I listen to the earth. I mean, as a geologist, I am listening to the earth. I'm listening to the rocks. I'm trying to understand the way that we interact with those resources and what that means geopolitically. So you can apply those questions anywhere. It's just asking them and getting geologists to do this research or social scientists to do this research to really engage with this theory more. And I think that's where we're at right now, is really just trying to elevate this to geology departments, elevate this to other folks so that we get this conversation rolling, that there is an alternative, innovative way to think about the subsurface that doesn't have to be extractive, that allows us to find different ways of thinking about how we engage in this critical mineral conversation. I think that is really important, that it can be applied anywhere to any context because you're just asking these important geological questions and listening to what the planet can tell us about those relationships.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. This is such an interesting and important topic. And, we could obviously keep talking about this for hours. So really looking forward to having you back again for another talk. And also really looking forward to, it's great to have you on the team and looking forward to engaging on these and other really important issues. Thank you so much for sharing your time and your fieldwork and your unique perspective. And thank you all so much for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you again next week.
Thank you, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much.